At 17, Arya Vale had already decided she was different. Smarter, colder, above consequence. When the case first broke, journalists called her the girl without remorse. She corrected them during a pre-trial hearing, her voice calm and measured. Remorse is just bad math, she said, as if explaining a theorem. She smiled through every hearing, speaking of philosophy and control like her crimes were an academic paper. The defense insisted she could not comprehend what she had done.
The prosecution knew she understood all too well. Her smirk unnerved everyone. Cameras captured her studying her own reflection in the glass dividers. She would say quietly, "They will name a book after me." But one file, a backup she thought she had erased, silenced the performance. A brief journal entry, time-stamped the night before the murders, describing the plan in detail. The courtroom held its breath as the judge read her words aloud. When he said, "life without parole," her calm cracked. No applause, no headlines, no fame. Only a sound halfway between a sob and disbelief, her genius unraveling under the one formula she had miscalculated: justice. The morning of her arraignment, Arya Vale entered the Kingsbarrow County Courthouse wearing the standard orange jumpsuit issued to all pre-trial detainees, a white undershirt visible beneath the collar. Her dark hair had been pulled back into a neat ponytail, and, despite the circumstances, her posture remained perfect. Straight spine, chin level, eyes forward. She moved through the corridor flanked by two deputies, her wrists bound in front of her by steel handcuffs. But she walked as though she were entering a lecture hall rather than a criminal courtroom. Reporters lined the hallway, their cameras flashing in rapid succession. She did not flinch. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, just enough to catch the light, and allowed the faintest smile to touch her lips. One photographer would later describe it as the most unsettling expression he had ever captured, confident and empty all at once. The courtroom itself was packed, every bench filled with spectators, journalists, and members of the community who had followed the case since the bodies of Mason Lee and Harper Denton were discovered 3 weeks earlier. The victims had been classmates of Arya's at Kingsbarrow Regional High School, both 17, both found in the school's abandoned art studio after a custodian noticed the door ajar late one Friday evening. The scene had been carefully staged, their bodies positioned like figures in a tableau, arranged with deliberate precision. The violence inflicted upon them was methodical, not frenzied. That detail alone had sent investigators down a path they rarely traveled when dealing with teenage suspects. This was not a crime of passion. It was something colder. Judge Harold Adler presided over the arraignment. He was a man in his early 60s, grey-haired and stern-faced, with a reputation for running his courtroom with precision and little tolerance for theatrics. He reviewed the documents before him as Arya was led to the defense table, where her court-appointed attorney, Marcus Brennan, stood waiting. Brennan was a public defender in his 40s, competent but visibly uncomfortable with the attention this case had drawn. He had tried to speak with Arya multiple times in the days leading up to this hearing, attempting to establish some rapport, some baseline of trust. Each conversation had left him feeling as though he was speaking to someone performing the role of defendant rather than living it. Judge Adler looked up from his papers and addressed the room. "This court is now in session. The matter before us is the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania versus Aria Vale. The defendant is charged with 2 counts of murder in the 2nd degree. Ms. Vale, please stand." Arya rose smoothly, her hands still cuffed in front of her. She stood beside Brennan, her expression calm, almost serene. The judge continued, "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." "Do you understand these rights as I have read them to you?" "I do, Your Honor," Arya replied. Her voice was clear, articulate, without a trace of fear or hesitation. "How do you plead to the charges of 2 counts of murder in the 2nd degree?" "Not guilty." The words hung in the air. Not guilty. Spoken with such certainty, such ease, that several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Judge Adler made a note in his file and then looked up at the prosecution table, where Assistant District Attorney Dean Monroe sat with his team. Monroe was a seasoned prosecutor, 48 years old, with a track record of winning difficult cases. He had handled gang violence, domestic homicides, and cold cases that spanned decades. But this case, he had told his wife the night before, felt different. The defendant was not trying to hide. She was performing. "Mr. Monroe," the judge said, "does the Commonwealth wish to make a statement regarding bail?" Monroe stood, buttoning his suit jacket as he did so. "Yes, Your Honor. The Commonwealth requests that the defendant be held without bail. The charges are severe. 2 young people are dead. The evidence suggests premeditation and a disturbing lack of remorse. Miss Vale presents a danger to the community and a significant flight risk given the potential sentence she faces." Brennan rose immediately. "Your Honor, Miss Vale is 17 years old. She has no prior criminal record. She has deep ties to this community. Her family resides here. She was a student in good standing at Kingsbarrow Regional High School before her arrest. There is no evidence she poses a flight risk. We request reasonable bail so that she may assist in her own defense." Judge Adler considered both arguments. He glanced at Arya, who stood perfectly still, her gaze fixed somewhere in the middle distance, as though she were contemplating something far more interesting than her own fate. After a long moment, he spoke. "Given the severity of the charges and the nature of the alleged crimes, bail is denied. The defendant will remain in custody pending trial. We will reconvene for a preliminary hearing in 2 weeks. This court is adjourned." The gavel struck. The sound echoed through the room. Arya did not react. She turned slightly, glancing back at the gallery, and her eyes found the cameras once more. She held the gaze for a beat too long, then allowed herself to be led away by the deputies. As she passed the prosecution table, Monroe watched her closely. She met his eyes and smiled just a fraction, before disappearing through the side door that led back to the holding cells. Monroe sat down heavily, exhaling through his nose. His co-counsel, a younger woman named Samantha Torres, leaned over and whispered, "Did you see that? She is daring us to call her brilliant." Monroe nodded slowly. "That is exactly what she is doing. And we are going to prove she is not as smart as she thinks." The preliminary hearing, 2 weeks later, brought new witnesses and the first glimpses of the investigation that had been building since Arya's arrest. Detective Rowan Harris took the stand first, a 15-year veteran of the Kingsbarrow County Police Department with a methodical approach to casework and a reputation for never cutting corners. Monroe led him through the basics. "Detective Harris, can you describe the scene you encountered on the evening of October 6th? Harris adjusted the microphone in front of him and spoke in a measured tone. "At approximately 8:45 in the evening,
I responded to a call from the high school regarding 2 bodies discovered in the art studio on the 3rd floor. When I arrived, patrol officers had already secured the perimeter. I entered the studio and observed 2 deceased individuals, later identified as Mason Lee and Harper Denton, both 17 years old. They were positioned on the floor in what appeared to be a deliberate arrangement. Mason was lying on his back near the east wall, arms extended outward. Harper was positioned approximately 6 feet away, on her side, one hand reaching toward Mason. The scene was unusual in its presentation. Can you elaborate on what you mean by unusual? Monroe asked. Harris nodded. In most homicides involving violence, especially those committed by young offenders, there is evidence of chaos, rage, disorganization. This scene was the opposite. The victims' bodies had been moved post-mortem. Blood patterns indicated they had been killed in different locations within the studio and then repositioned. Personal items, backpacks, phones were arranged in a corner, stacked neatly. There were no signs of a struggle in the immediate area where the bodies were found. Everything suggested careful planning and execution. What did you do next? We secured the scene and called in the forensics team. We began photographing and documenting every detail. We collected blood samples, fingerprints, trace evidence. We also began interviewing staff and students who had been in the building that day. Did any particular piece of evidence stand out during your initial investigation? Harris paused, then said, "Yes. We found a cell phone belonging to the defendant in a drawer in the art studio. It had been powered off. When we powered it on and examined it later with a warrant, we found text messages between Aria Vale and Mason Lee from the afternoon of the murders. She had asked him to meet her in the studio after school to discuss a project. Similar messages were found on Harper Denton's phone, so the defendant had lured both victims to the location where they were killed? "Objection," Brennan called out, rising from his seat. "Leading the witness, Your Honor." "Sustained," Judge Adler said. "Rephrase." "Mr. Monroe." Monroe nodded. "Detective Harris, based on the text messages you recovered, did you form a theory about how the victims came to be in the art studio?" "Yes. It appeared that Aria Vale had arranged to meet both individuals separately, under the pretense of working on a school project. Both victims arrived. Both were killed. Both were then staged in the manner I described." Monroe let that sit for a moment before continuing. "During your investigation, did you find any evidence suggesting a motive?" Harris glanced at his notes. "We interviewed teachers, classmates, and family members. Several individuals indicated that Aria had been socially isolated at school, but intellectually advanced. She had expressed interest in psychology, philosophy, and criminal justice. One teacher, Mr. Gregory Hall, told us that Aria had once submitted an essay on the concept of moral relativism that made him uncomfortable. He described it as clinically detached. Did you find any physical evidence linking Aria Vale to the murders?" "Yes. Fingerprints matching hers were found on objects in the studio. Blood trace evidence was found on clothing recovered from her home during the execution of a search warrant. Forensic analysis confirmed the blood belonged to Mason Lee." "Thank you, Detective. No further questions." Brennan rose for cross-examination, but his questions were perfunctory, aimed more at establishing reasonable doubt than dismantling the detective's testimony. He asked about other potential suspects, about whether the studio was accessible to others, about whether evidence could have been contaminated. Harris answered each question calmly, methodically. By the end, it was clear the defense had little to work with. When Harris stepped down, Monroe called his next witness, Dr. Elliot Nash,
a forensic psychologist who had been asked to evaluate Arya during the pretrial phase.
Nash was in his 50s, bald, with wire-rimmed glasses and a quiet demeanor. He had spent 3 hours interviewing Arya in the county jail. Monroe asked him to summarize his findings. Dr. Nash, based on your evaluation, what can you tell us about the defendant's mental state? Nash folded his hands on the witness stand. Miss Vale presents as highly intelligent, articulate, and emotionally detached.
During our sessions, she demonstrated a clear understanding of right and wrong. She was able to discuss moral concepts in abstract terms. However, she showed no emotional response when discussing the victims. No sadness, no regret, no empathy. When I asked her how she felt about what happened, she said, "I feel nothing. They are gone. I remain. That is the only truth that matters." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Adler rapped his gavel once. "Order!" Monroe pressed on. "Did you diagnose her with any specific condition?" "I noted traits consistent with narcissistic personality disorder, grandiose sense of self-importance, lack of empathy, preoccupation with fantasies of power and success. She repeatedly referred to herself as different, as someone who operated outside conventional morality. She also made several statements suggesting she believed this case would bring her fame and recognition." "Did she express any remorse?" "None whatsoever." "Thank you, Doctor." Brennan's cross-examination attempted to reframe the testimony, suggesting that Arya's behavior could also be explained by trauma, by a dissociative response to bullying, by an adolescent brain not yet fully developed. Nash conceded that adolescent brains were still maturing, particularly in areas related to impulse control and judgment, but he maintained that Arya's behavior suggested something beyond typical teenage impulsivity. This was calculated. This was intentional. As the preliminary hearing concluded, Judge Adler ruled that there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. Arya was led out of the courtroom once again, and once again she paused to glance at the cameras. This time, she whispered something to one of the deputies escorting her. A reporter seated nearby later claimed she had said, "They will study me now." The trial began 6 months later. By then, the case had attracted national attention. News outlets from across the country sent correspondents. The courtroom was equipped with additional security. The jury selection process had been exhaustive, with both sides carefully vetting potential jurors for bias, for preconceived notions, for any hint that they had already formed an opinion. 12 jurors and 2 alternates were eventually seated, a mix of ages and backgrounds, all of whom swore they could be impartial. The prosecution's opening statement was delivered by Dean Monroe. He stood before the jury, hands in his pockets, his tone conversational but firm. "This case is about a young woman who believed she was smarter than everyone else. Smarter than her classmates, smarter than the police, smarter than this court. Aria Vale did not kill Mason Lee and Harper Denton in a moment of rage or passion. She killed them because she wanted to, because she believed she could get away with it, because she wanted to prove something to herself and to the world." Over the course of this trial, you will hear from detectives, forensic experts, teachers, and classmates. You will see evidence that leaves no doubt. This was not an accident. This was not self-defense. This was murder, premeditated, cold-blooded.
and we will prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. Brennan's opening statement took a different approach. He stood before the jury, his expression somber. Arya Vale is 17 years old. She is a child. Yes, she is intelligent. Yes, she is unusual. But intelligence and difference do not equal guilt. The prosecution wants you to believe that Arya is a monster, that she killed her classmates as some sort of experiment. But the truth is more complicated. Arya was bullied. She was isolated. She struggled with mental health issues that went unaddressed. On the day these tragic deaths occurred, something broke inside her. She did not plan this. She did not orchestrate it. What happened was a terrible, impulsive act committed by a young person in crisis. The evidence will show that this was not premeditated murder, and we will ask you to consider that sometimes the line between tragedy and crime is not as clear as the prosecution wants you to believe. The first week of trial focused on establishing the facts of the case. Monroe called witnesses who described the discovery of the bodies, the investigation, the forensic analysis. A crime scene photographer presented images that made several jurors look away. The school custodian who found the bodies testified, his voice shaking. The medical examiner described the causes of death. Mason Lee had died from a stab wound to the chest that punctured his heart. Harper Denton had been strangled. Both had defensive wounds, indicating they had tried to fight back. Throughout these proceedings, Arya sat at the defense table, her expression neutral. She took notes on a legal pad, occasionally leaning over to whisper something to Brennan. She never cried. She never looked distressed. When particularly graphic testimony was presented, she watched the witness with what could only be described as clinical interest. One of the most damaging witnesses during the first week was a classmate named Jordan Cross, who had known Arya since middle school. Monroe called Jordan to the stand on the fourth day of trial. Jordan was nervous, fidgeting with the hem of their shirt as they answered questions. Jordan, can you describe your relationship with Aria Vale? Jordan glanced toward the defense table, then quickly looked away. We were in some of the same advanced classes. We were not friends exactly, but we talked sometimes. She was really smart, but also kind of intense. What do you mean by intense? Jordan swallowed. She would say things that made people uncomfortable. Like once in English class, we were reading Crime and Punishment, and she said she understood Raskolnikov. She said some people are extraordinary, and they should not be bound by the same rules as everyone else. The teacher tried to steer the conversation back to the text, but Arya kept pushing. She said morality was subjective. She said history only remembers the bold. Did she ever talk about Mason or Harper? Jordan nodded. A few weeks before it happened, she mentioned them. She said they were predictable. She said they moved through life like everyone else, following scripts. I did not think much of it at the time, but looking back, it felt like she was studying them. Thank you, Jordan. No further questions. Brennan attempted to undermine the testimony, suggesting Jordan might be misremembering, might be influenced by hindsight bias. But the damage was done. The jury had heard someone describe Arya as calculating, as someone who viewed others as objects of study rather than human beings. The second week of trial brought the digital evidence. This was when the case began to turn decisively against the defense. Monroe called to the stand Christopher Yates, a digital forensics expert with the Pennsylvania State Police. Yates had examined Arya's laptop, her phone, and her cloud storage accounts. He explained the process methodically. When a file is deleted from a computer, it is not immediately erased. It is marked as space that can be overwritten. But until that happens, the data remains recoverable. In Miss Vale's case, she had deleted several files from her laptop in the days following the murders. However, those files have been automatically backed up to a cloud storage service linked to her account. We were able to retrieve them. Monroe projected the recovered files onto a screen for the jury to see. Most were mundane: school assignments, notes, photographs. But one file stood out. It was a text document titled simply Thoughts. Yates explained that the file had been created 3 months before the murders and modified multiple times. The final modification occurred the night before Mason and Harper were killed. "Can you tell us what this file contains?" Monroe asked. Yates clicked through several pages of text. The document appears to be a personal journal. Miss Vale wrote about her frustrations with school, with her peers, with what she perceived as the mundane nature of everyday life. There are passages where she discusses philosophical ideas, references to Nietzsche, Camus, and other existentialist thinkers. But there are also passages that suggest she was planning something. Can you read one of those passages for the jury?
Yates scrolled to a specific section and read aloud.
People think consequence is inevitable, but consequence is just another word for fear. If you remove fear, you remove consequence. If you remove consequence, you remove limits. I want to see what happens when limits disappear. Monroe let that sit for a moment. Did you find any other concerning entries? Yes, several. In one entry, dated approximately 2 weeks before the murders, she wrote, "I am tired of theory. I need proof. I need to know if I am capable of what I think I am capable of." Another entry, dated 1 week before, mentions Mason and Harper by name. She wrote, "They will serve a purpose. They do not know it yet, but they will help me become something more." The courtroom was silent. Monroe moved closer to the jury box. "Mr. Yates, you mentioned that the file was last modified the night before the murders. Can you tell us what was added during that final modification?" Yates clicked to the final page of the document. The last entry is brief but significant. It reads, "Tomorrow they will die for art, and I will die famous." The words appeared on the screen in plain black text. Simple, undeniable. "Tomorrow they will die for art, and I will die famous." Several jurors leaned forward, staring at the screen. One woman covered her mouth. Monroe stood silent for a long moment, letting the impact of the statement settle over the room. "Mr. Yates, can you confirm the timestamp of this entry?" "Yes. The metadata indicates it was created at 11:53 in the evening on October 5th. Mason Lee and Harper Denton were killed on October 6th, sometime between 3 and 5 in the afternoon." "And can you confirm authorship?" "Yes. The document was created on Aria Vale's laptop using her user account. The cloud backup was linked to her email address. There is no indication that anyone else accessed her account or created this file." Monroe turned to face the defense table. Aria's expression had shifted. The calm, detached mask she had worn for weeks was still in place, but there was a tightness around her eyes, a rigidity in her posture. She whispered something to Brennan, who shook his head slightly. "Thank you, Mr. Yates. Your witness." Brennan's cross-examination focused on the possibility of hacking, of someone else accessing Aria's account, of the file being fabricated. Yates patiently explained that there was no evidence of unauthorized access, no indication of tampering. The file was genuine. Brennan pressed harder, asking whether Arya's writings could be interpreted as fiction, as creative expression rather than a literal plan.
Yates acknowledged that text alone could be ambiguous, but when combined with the other evidence, the timeline, the text messages luring the victims to the studio, the blood evidence, the interpretation became clear. When Yates stepped down, Monroe called his next witness, Dr. Linda Park, a forensic psychologist who specialized in adolescent offenders. Park had not interviewed Arya directly, but she had reviewed all available materials, the journal entries, the police reports, the witness statements. Monroe asked her to provide context. Dr. Park, based on your review of the evidence, what can you tell us about the defendant's mindset leading up to these murders? Park spoke carefully, choosing her words with precision. The journal entries reveal a young person who was deeply narcissistic and detached from normal emotional responses. She viewed others as means to an end. She was preoccupied with the idea of being exceptional, of transcending ordinary morality. The language she used, references to art, to fame, to purpose, suggests she saw these murders not as crimes, but as acts of self-expression. She wanted to create something that would be remembered. She wanted to prove she was capable of something others were not. Is this consistent with premeditated murder? Absolutely. This was not an impulsive act. This was planned. The journal entries show a progression of thought over weeks and months. She moved from abstract theory to concrete planning. She identified her victims. She lured them to a specific location. She carried out the murders and staged the scene. Every step was deliberate. Brennan's cross-examination attempted to introduce the possibility of dissociation, of a break from reality, of adolescent impulsivity masked by articulate language. Park pushed back. Dissociation typically involves a lack of memory or awareness. Miss Vale remembers everything. She documented everything. Impulsivity involves acting without thought. This was the opposite. This was methodical. As the third week of trial began, the prosecution was nearing the end of its case. Monroe had established motive, means, and opportunity. He had presented overwhelming evidence of premeditation, but he had not yet revealed the full extent of the smoking gun. He had shown the jury excerpts from Arya's journal, but he had held back the most damning piece, waiting for the right moment. That moment came on the 15th day of trial. The courtroom was packed as always, every seat taken, reporters poised with notebooks and recorders. Arya sat at the defense table, her orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the dark wood paneling of the courtroom. She had been quieter in recent days, less inclined to whisper comments to Brennan, less interested in making eye contact with the cameras. Perhaps she sensed what was coming. Perhaps she was beginning to understand that her performance was losing its audience. Monroe stood and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, the Commonwealth calls Detective Rowan Harris to the stand." Harris, who had testified earlier in the trial, returned to the witness box. He had been present for every day of the trial, watching, listening, waiting for this moment. Monroe approached him with a file in hand. "Detective Harris, during your investigation, you recovered digital files from the defendant's laptop and cloud storage. We have already discussed some of those files, but there is one piece of evidence that we have not yet fully addressed. Can you tell the jury about the file labeled October 5th Final?" Harris nodded. "During our forensic examination, we found a file that had been deleted from the defendant's laptop, but remained in her cloud backup. The file was a text document, created and modified on the night of October 5th, the night before the murders.
The defendant had attempted to delete it from all her devices after the crimes were committed,
But she did not realize that the cloud backup retains files even after local deletion unless specifically purged. We recovered the file in its entirety. Monroe turned to the jury. This file is the single most important piece of evidence in this case. It is the defendant's own words, written hours before she killed Mason Lee and Harper Denton. It is her confession, her plan, her motive, all laid out in her own handwriting, so to speak. He turned back to Harris. Detective, can you describe what this file contains? Harris pulled out a printed copy of the file and began to read. The document is approximately 3 pages long. It begins with a reflection on mortality and fame. Miss Vale wrote, "People fear death because they fear being forgotten. But I have realized something. If you die for nothing, you are forgotten. If you kill for nothing, you are forgotten. But if you create something unforgettable, even something terrible, you live forever." She continues, "I have spent months thinking about this. I have read about killers who became legends, not because they were evil, but because they were bold. Because they did what others only imagined. Tomorrow, I will do the same. I will create something that cannot be ignored." Monroe interrupted. "Detective, does she mention the victims by name?" "Yes. In the second page, she writes, 'Mason and Harper will serve as the foundation. They are perfect for this. Mason, because he is kind and trusting. Harper, because she is ambitious and curious. They will both come if I ask. They will both believe me. And when it is done, their deaths will not be meaningless. They will be part of something larger. They will be part of my work." Several jurors exchanged glances. One woman shook her head slightly. Monroe continued. "And the final entry, the one we showed the jury earlier. Tomorrow they will die for art, and I will die famous. When was that written?" Harris checked the timestamp again. 11:53, on the evening of October 5th, less than 16 hours before the murders. Monroe walked over to the projection screen and brought up the full text of the file. He let the jury read it in silence. The words filled the screen, line after line of Aria's thoughts, her justifications, her excitement. One passage read, "I have chosen the art studio because it is poetic. A place meant for creation will become a place of destruction. I have chosen these two because they represent everything I am not. They are ordinary. They are safe. They will never be remembered for anything they did. But they will be remembered because of me." Monroe turned back to the jury. This is not a troubled teenager acting on impulse. This is a calculated, premeditated plan, written in the defendant's own words, time-stamped to the night before the murders, describing in detail what she intended to do and why. This is the smoking gun. "This is proof beyond any doubt." He paused, then added, "And when you combine this with the physical evidence, with the forensic evidence, with the testimony of witnesses, there is only one conclusion. Aria Vale murdered Mason Lee and Harper Denton because she wanted to. Because she thought it would make her famous. Because she believed she was above consequence." Monroe returned to his seat. The courtroom was silent. Even the reporters had stopped scribbling in their notebooks. Everyone focused on the screen, on the words written by a 17-year-old girl who believed murder was art. Brennan stood slowly. He had no good options. The file was authentic. The timestamp was verified. The content was damning. He approached the witness stand, his expression grim. Detective Harris, is it possible that this file was meant as fiction, as creative writing? Harris shook his head. We considered that possibility, but the details in the file match exactly what happened. She described the location. She described the victims. She described her intent. And then, less than a day later, those exact events occurred. That is not fiction. That is a plan. Could someone else have accessed her account and created this file? No. As Mr. Yates testified earlier, there is no evidence of unauthorized access. The file was created on her laptop using her account from her home. The Internet Protocol address confirms it. Brennan tried a few more angles, but it was futile. The evidence was airtight. When he finally sat down, he looked defeated. Arya leaned over and whispered something to him. He shook his head. She whispered again, more insistently. He whispered back, and her face tightened. For the first time since the trial began, her composure cracked. She sat back in her chair, staring at the screen, at her own words projected for everyone to see. Monroe rested his case the following day. Brennan called a few witnesses in the defense's case, the psychologist who testified about adolescent brain development, a former teacher who described Arya as troubled but not violent, a neighbor who said she had always been polite. But none of it mattered. The smoking gun had already done its work. The jury had seen the evidence. They had read her words. They knew what she had planned, what she had done, and why. Closing arguments took place on the 18th day of trial. Monroe spoke first, summarizing the evidence methodically. He reminded the jury of the journal entries, the digital forensics, the testimony of witnesses. He reminded them of the file written the night before the murders. He reminded them that 2 young people were dead because Aria Vale wanted to be famous. He ended his statement by saying, "The defendant believed she could commit the perfect crime. She believed she was smarter than everyone in this room. But she made one mistake. She documented everything. And now, her own words will convict her." Brennan's closing argument was somber and brief. He acknowledged the tragedy, the loss, the pain inflicted on the victims' families. He asked the jury to consider Arya's age, her mental state, the possibility of rehabilitation. He asked them to show mercy. But his words felt hollow, even as he spoke them. The evidence was too strong, the intent too clear. The jury deliberated for less than a day. When they returned, the 4-person stood and delivered the verdict, guilty on both counts of first-degree murder. The charges had been elevated from second-degree based on the evidence of premeditation. Arya sat motionless as the verdict was read. Her hands, folded on the table in front of her, trembled slightly. But she did not cry. Not yet. Sentencing was scheduled for 1 week later. During that time, victim impact statements were prepared. Mason Lee's parents wrote about their son's kindness, his love of music, his dreams of becoming an engineer. Harper Denton's mother wrote about her daughter's ambition, her desire to be a journalist, her infectious laugh. Both families described the hole left in their lives, the grief that would never fully heal, the anger at a young woman who had stolen their children's futures
for her own selfish purposes. On the day of sentencing, the courtroom was once again filled to capacity. Arya was led in, wearing her orange jumpsuit and white undershirt, her wrists cuffed. She sat at the defense table, her face pale, her eyes fixed on the judge's bench. Monroe and his team sat across from her, calm and resolved. The families of the victims sat in the front row of the gallery, holding each other's hands, tears already streaming down their faces. Judge Adler entered and took his seat. He reviewed the file before him, then looked up at the courtroom. This is a sentencing hearing for Aria Vale, convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder. Before I impose sentence, I will hear from the victims' families. Mason Lee's father stood first. He was a small man, soft-spoken, his voice breaking as he read from a prepared statement. My son was 17 years old. He had his whole life ahead of him. He was kind. He was smart. He was going to do great things. And he was taken from us by someone who saw him as nothing more than a means to an end. Someone who valued her own ego more than his life. I do not understand how someone so young can be so cruel. I do not understand how someone can plan a murder and feel nothing. But I know this. My son deserved better. He deserved to live. And she deserves to face the consequences of what she did. He sat down, his wife sobbing beside him. Harper Denton's mother stood next. She was taller, her voice stronger, but the pain was just as evident. My daughter wanted to change the world. She wanted to tell stories, to give voice to people who had none. She was passionate and bright and full of life. And she was murdered by someone who thought fame was worth more than a human life. Aria Vale wanted to be remembered. Well, she will be. She will be remembered as the person who killed my daughter. She will be remembered as someone who chose ego over empathy, who chose violence over humanity. And I hope she spends every day of the rest of her life regretting that choice. She sat down, wiping her eyes. Judge Adler nodded, his expression somber. He then turned his attention to Arya. Miss Vale, you have been convicted by a jury of your peers of 2 counts of first-degree murder. Before I impose a sentence, I want to address you directly. Arya looked up, meeting his gaze. For a moment, her mask slipped. Her eyes were wide, fearful. No longer the cold, detached stare she had worn throughout the trial. Judge Adler spoke slowly, deliberately. I have presided over this court for 23 years. I have seen many defendants stand where you stand now. I have seen people who committed terrible acts in moments of rage, in moments of desperation, in moments when they lost control. I have seen people who made mistakes, who were shaped by circumstances beyond their control, who deserved a chance at redemption. But you are not one of those people. He paused, letting the words settle. You did not kill Mason Lee and Harper Denton in a moment of passion or fear. You did not kill them because you were threatened or desperate. You killed them because you wanted to, because you believed it would make you special, because you believed you were above the rules that govern the rest of us. You spent weeks planning their deaths. You wrote about it. You fantasized about it. You imagined the fame it would bring you. And then you carried it out. Arya's hands clenched into fists. Her breathing quickened. Judge Adler continued, his voice rising. You sat in this courtroom day after day,
watching the grief of the families you destroyed, and you felt nothing. You listened to testimony about the violence you inflicted, and you took notes, as though you were studying a case study. You treated this trial like a performance, like an opportunity to showcase your intellect. You believed that your intelligence made you superior, that your ability to plan and execute these murders proved you were extraordinary. But you were wrong. He leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. You are not extraordinary. You are not special. You are a person who committed a heinous act and believed you would be celebrated for it. You sought eternity through cruelty. You believed consequence was a myth, something that applied to others, but not to you. You wanted to live forever in the public consciousness, to be studied, to be remembered. Well, Miss Vale, I am going to grant you that wish. You will live forever, but not in the way you imagined. Arya's eyes filled with tears. Her composure, so carefully maintained for months, began to crumble. Judge Adler's voice grew colder, sharper. You will spend the rest of your life in prison. You will wake up every day in a cell. You will eat meals provided by the state. You will follow rules set by others. You will watch years turn into decades, and you will know that every moment of your existence is a consequence of your choices. You will not be famous. You will not be celebrated. You will be forgotten, except by the families whose lives you destroyed. And that, Miss Vale, is the only legacy you will leave. He picked up the sentencing document and read aloud. For the murder of Mason Lee, I sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For the murder of Harper Denton, I sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, to be served consecutively. You will never leave prison. You will never experience freedom again. You sought to create something unforgettable through violence. Instead, you have created your own eternal prison. Arya broke. The tears that had been building spilled over, and a sob escaped her throat. She tried to speak, tried to say something, but the words caught. She shook her head, disbelieving, her hands trembling violently. The cameras captured it all, the moment when the legend she had tried to build shattered under the weight of reality. Judge Adler set down the document. This court is adjourned. The gavel struck. Arya was led away, her legs unsteady, her face streaked with tears. She did not look at the cameras this time. She did not try to perform. She was just a 17-year-old girl who had made an irreversible mistake, and the full weight of it had finally, irrevocably, crushed her. In the days following the sentencing, the case faded from the headlines. New stories emerged. New tragedies captured public attention. Mason Lee and Harper Denton were remembered by their families, by their friends, by a community that mourned them. Aria Vale was sent to a maximum security women's prison in western Pennsylvania, where she would spend the rest of her life among others who had committed unforgivable acts. The courtroom was cleaned, the files archived, the cameras moved on. But for those who had been present during the trial, the image of Arya's final moment remained. The way her face crumpled when the judge spoke. The way her hands shook as she was led away. The way her carefully constructed myth of brilliance and invincibility disintegrated in an instant. She had believed fame was forever.
She had believed she could transcend consequence. She had been wrong. And in the end, all that remained was a girl in an orange jumpsuit, crying in a courtroom, realizing too late that eternity behind bars was not the legacy she had imagined.